The November wind arrived first, howling through the bare-branched elms that lined the drive like skeletal sentinels, their twisted limbs clawing at a moonless sky that promised nothing but cold. Miss Evelyn Hartley felt the carriage wheels grind against gravel as Ashworth Manor materialized from the darkness, a massive stone edifice that seemed less built than carved from the very night itself, its grey walls drinking in what little light the coach lanterns offered. It was midnight when she arrived, though the summons had specified no particular hour. The letter from the Duke's solicitor had been brief to the point of terseness, requiring a governess for his orphaned niece with immediate effect. Salary generous, references impeccable, sentiment unnecessary. Evelyn had read those final two words with a chill that had nothing to do with the season. Now, standing before the manor's great oak doors, she understood that the coldness in that letter had been no accident, but prophecy. The windows stretched across the facade like blind eyes, dark and lightless, save for a single yellow glow in what must be a study or library on the second floor. The gardens that flanked the entrance were not merely dormant with winter, but actively neglected, roses unpruned and wild, hedges grown ragged, the fountain at the circle's center cracked and dry, its stone nymph staring eternally at nothing. Everything about Ashworth Manor whispered of beauty abandoned, of care withdrawn, of a household that had simply stopped trying. Evelyn felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, this atmosphere of deliberate desolation, and she thought, asterisk, this is a place where grief has taken root and been allowed to grow unchecked, choking out all else. Asterisk, the door opened before she could knock, revealing a tall, angular woman whose severe black dress and iron-grey hair pulled back in a merciless knot spoke of rigid propriety maintained through force of will alone. Miss Hartley, the housekeeper said it was not a question. I am Mrs. Dawson. You are expected. Your trunk will be brought to your chambers. She stepped aside with an efficiency that discouraged pleasantries, and Evelyn entered a foyer of dark wood and darker shadows, where portraits of stern-faced Ashworths seemed to judge her from their frames. The air inside was scarcely warmer than outside, as though the household begrudged even heat. You will begin your duties with Lady Caroline at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mrs. Dawson continued, leading Evelyn up a grand staircase whose burgundy runner had faded to rust in patches. His Grace expects weekly reports on her progress, delivered in writing. You will take your meals in the governess's dining room. The Duke tolerates no sentiment in this household, Miss Hartley, and no disorder. The child is to be educated, not coddled. There have been difficulties with previous governesses who misunderstood the nature of their position. The words carried a warning sharp as winter ice, and Evelyn heard what was not said. Others had failed here, had been found wanting, had been dismissed for the sin of caring too deeply in a house that had sworn off care entirely. Mrs. Dawson led Evelyn to the study at precisely 7 o'clock the following morning, knocking with 3 sharp raps before opening the door to reveal a room that might have been handsome once, but now felt like a mausoleum of dark wood and darker mood. The Duke of Ashworth stood with his back to them, a tall figure silhouetted against grey morning light that filtered weakly through windows that looked as though they had not been properly cleaned in months, and when he turned, Evelyn understood immediately why the servant spoke his name in hushed tones, edged with something between respect and fear. He was a man carved from winter itself, sharp-featured and austere, with iron-grey eyes that held no warmth whatsoever, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, though he could not have been much past 35, his posture rigid with the kind of control that spoke not of natural discipline, but of something forcibly contained. Miss Hartley, he said, his voice a cold instrument of precision, devoid of inflection or welcome. You come with exemplary references, I trust, Mrs. Dawson has outlined the fundamental requirements of your position. Evelyn curtsied, meeting those glacial eyes with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. She has, Your Grace. He moved behind his desk, a massive affair of carved mahogany that seemed designed to create distance, and gestured curtly for her to sit in the chair opposite, though he himself remained standing, as if even this brief interview was an imposition he could barely tolerate. My niece, Lady Caroline, requires education befitting her station, he continued, his words clipped and formal. You will instruct her in literature, mathematics, French, history, and the deportment expected of a young lady of quality. You will maintain strict schedules and discipline. What I do not require, Miss Hartley, is sentiment. The child has been indulged in her grief long enough. Previous governesses have made the error of encouraging excessive emotional display and attachment, which serves no purpose but to prolong suffering. You will educate her mind, not coddle her feelings. Is this understood? Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest at his words, at the deliberate coldness with which he spoke of a grieving child, but she noticed what he perhaps did not intend her to see, the white-knuckled grip with which his hands pressed against the desk's edge, as though he were holding himself upright through sheer force of will, the muscle that jumped in his jaw, the way his eyes, for just a fraction of a moment, moved to something behind her before returning to her face with renewed hardness. She glanced back and saw it. A portrait turned to face the wall, only its ornate golden frame visible, and beside the cold fireplace, an accumulation of ash so thick it suggested fires burned long and often, as though the Duke spent his nights feeding papers or memories, or perhaps simply hours into flames that offered warmth to no one. "I understand your requirements, Your Grace," Evelyn said carefully, "though I wonder if I might inquire about Lady Caroline's particular temperament and interests, so that I might better tailor her education to—" "Her interests are irrelevant," the Duke interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "You will follow the curriculum I have outlined. You will submit written reports each Friday. You will not discuss household matters with the servants, nor will you involve yourself in affairs beyond the schoolroom. You are to be a governess, Miss Hartley, not a confidant, not a companion, and certainly not a substitute for what has been lost. Caroline must learn that life continues regardless of our wishes, and that duty supersedes feeling. You may go." It was a dismissal so abrupt and final that Evelyn found herself standing and curtsying again before she had fully processed it. But as she reached the door, she turned back once more and saw him collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders bearing a weight that seemed almost to crush him, and she thought, "This is not a cruel man but a broken one, and he has mistaken his own survival for wisdom." The schoolroom was located in the east wing on the 3rd floor, a space that might once have been cheerful with its tall windows facing the morning sun, but now felt as colourless and lifeless as everything else at Ashworth Manor, the walls a pale grey that seemed to leach warmth from the air, the furniture serviceable but austere, and there, sitting perfectly still at a small desk with her hands folded in her lap, was Lady Caroline Ashworth, a child so silent and motionless she seemed less a living girl than a portrait of one, her 7 years weighing on her like 70. She was dressed entirely in grey, a mourning shade that made her pale skin appear almost translucent, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that held enormous brown eyes that seemed far too old, far too aware, haunted by things no child should have to carry. When Evelyn entered and offered a gentle greeting, Caroline did not speak, did not smile, merely watched her with those terrible knowing eyes that saw everything and expected nothing, and Evelyn felt her heart contract with a pain that was both immediate and achingly familiar, for she recognized in this small ghost the girl she herself had once been orphaned at 9, passed between relatives who saw her as obligation rather than gift, learning early that silence was safer than hope and that love was something that left without warning. Mrs. Dawson had accompanied her to make introductions, her voice brisk and businesslike as she informed Caroline that Miss Hartley was her new governess and that she was expected to apply herself diligently to her studies, and then she departed with a rustle of severe black skirts, leaving Evelyn alone with a child who had not yet moved, had not yet acknowledged her presence beyond that unsettling, watchful stare. From the kitchen maid who had brought morning tea, Evelyn had learned in whispered fragments the essential tragedy. Lord and Lady Ashworth, Caroline's parents, had died 6 months prior in a carriage accident during a terrible storm. The horses had bolted, the carriage had overturned, both had been killed instantly, and Caroline, who had been left at home, had become an orphan in a single rain-soaked night. The Duke, her father's older brother and only living relative, had brought her to Ashworth Manor but kept himself distant, unable or unwilling to offer comfort, and the child had retreated into silence as into a fortress. Now Evelyn moved slowly, deliberately, taking the chair beside Caroline rather than behind the teacher's desk, making herself smaller, less imposing, and she said softly, "I thought we might begin by reading together, if that suits you. I have brought a book of fairy tales, nothing too demanding for our first day. Or, if you prefer, we might simply sit quietly for a time. There is no urgency, Caroline. We have all the time we need." Still, the child said nothing, but something shifted in those dark eyes, a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps confusion, as though kindness were a language she had forgotten. Evelyn opened the book and began to read aloud, not requiring response or participation, simply offering her voice as a gentle presence in the grey room. And though Caroline remained silent, after some minutes, Evelyn noticed the small hands had loosened their grip, the rigid shoulders had dropped slightly, and when she glanced up, she found the child watching her with an expression that was no longer quite so guarded, and she thought, asterisk, here is where healing must begin, not in demands or expectations, but in patient presence, in allowing grief its space while offering, quietly and without insistence, the possibility that life might one day feel bearable again. Asterisk. Weeks passed in a rhythm of small gestures and careful observations, the days shortening as November gave way to December, and Evelyn found herself attuned to the subtle patterns of Ashworth Manor in ways she had not anticipated. Most particularly, she became aware of the Duke's presence even when he did not announce himself, catching glimpses of his tall figure in the corridor outside the schoolroom door, always at a distance, always silent, watching their lessons with an intensity that suggested hunger rather than mere supervision, though he never entered, never spoke, never acknowledged that he was there at all. She would see him in the gardens during Caroline's brief recreation periods, standing motionless in the cold rain without hat or coat, staring at nothing with an expression of such profound desolation that it made her chest ache, and at night, when the manor settled into uneasy silence, she would hear his footsteps in the chambers below, hers pacing, endless pacing, as though he could not bear to be still, as though movement was the only thing keeping some terrible thing at bay. Caroline, meanwhile, began to change in increments so small that anyone less observant might have missed them entirely, but Evelyn noticed everything, the way the child's rigid posture softened slightly during their third week together. The morning she spoke her first word since Evelyn's arrival, a quiet yes, in response to a question about whether she would like to hear another chapter, and then, days later, a fragment of a sentence. "I liked that story," spoken so softly, Evelyn almost doubted she had heard it at all. Evelyn introduced watercolors during their fourth week, thinking that perhaps what could not be spoken might be expressed in color and form, and Caroline approached the paints with something that resembled cautious interest, the first spark of engagement Evelyn had witnessed. But what emerged on the paper was telling in its bleakness: grey skies, grey buildings, grey figures that might have been people, but seemed more like shadows, everything rendered in shades of sorrow and ash. And Evelyn said nothing critical, only praised the careful brushwork and asked gentle questions about what Caroline saw in her mind when she painted. The Duke's notes arrived each Friday without fail, delivered by Mrs. Dawson terse, formal acknowledgments of Evelyn's weekly reports, expressing curt approval of Caroline's progress in her studies, noting with apparent satisfaction that the child was becoming more tractable and disciplined. But he never came to see for himself, never asked to observe a lesson directly, never requested to speak with Evelyn beyond those cold written words, and yet she knew he was watching, always watching, and she began to understand that his distance was not indifference but fear, that he was a man standing on the far shore of a river he desperately wanted to cross, but believed himself incapable of traversing, and she found herself thinking of him at odd moments, wondering what he had been like before grief and guilt had carved him into this frozen monument, imagining what warmth might have once lived in those grey eyes, and she told herself firmly that such thoughts were foolish and inappropriate, that she was here for Caroline and Caroline alone, but her heart, that treacherous organ, seemed determined not to listen to reason. December arrived with the first true storm of winter, and on an evening when thunder cracked the sky like an axe, splitting wood and rain lashed against the windows with furious intensity, Evelyn was in her small chamber preparing the next day's lessons when she became aware of a terrible absence. Caroline was not in her room, not in the schoolroom, not in any of the places she might reasonably be found at this hour, and as lightning illuminated the corridor in stark white flashes, Evelyn felt her heart begin to race with a dread she could not name, but recognized instinctively. She searched with growing urgency, calling the child's name softly so as not to alarm the household, and it was only when she reached the library on the ground floor that she heard it, a sound so small and broken it was nearly lost beneath the thunder, a whimper of pure terror coming from behind the heavy velvet curtains near the eastern window. There, curled into the smallest possible version of herself, shaking so violently her teeth chattered, was Caroline, her face buried in her knees, her hands pressed over her ears as though she could block out the storm that raged outside. And when Evelyn knelt beside her and touched her shoulder gently, the child flinched and let out a sob that seemed torn from somewhere deep and wounded. "Caroline, darling, I am here," Evelyn said softly, carefully gathering the trembling child into her arms, and Caroline clung to her with desperate strength, her small body racked with sobs that had clearly been held back for far too long, and through the broken words that came between gasps for air, Evelyn understood times the storm. It was a storm like this, the night they died, the thunder and the horses screaming, and then they were gone, gone, gone forever. Evelyn held her tighter, rocking slightly, and began to sing without thinking. The lullabies her own mother had sung when Evelyn was small and frightened, simple melodies about stars and safety, and morning always coming, no matter how dark the night. And gradually, so gradually, Caroline's sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths, her grip loosened slightly, and she lay against Evelyn's chest as though she had finally found solid ground after months of drowning. The storm raged on through the night, and Evelyn did not move from that spot, sitting with her back against the wall beneath the window, Caroline in her lap, singing when the thunder grew too loud, and murmuring soft reassurances during the quieter moments. And sometime in the grey hour before dawn, when the rain had gentled to a steady whisper, Caroline finally fell into exhausted sleep, her face pressed against Evelyn's shoulder, one small hand fisted in the fabric of her dress. It was thus that the Duke found them when he entered the library, as pale morning light began to filter through the windows, Evelyn dishevelled and weary, holding his niece with infinite tenderness, both of them still curled together in a portrait of protective love, and he stopped in the doorway as though struck, his face transforming in a way Evelyn had never seen, the ice cracking, something raw and anguished and desperately longing, breaking through the frozen surface, his grey eyes suddenly bright with what might have been tears, and his hand reached toward them as though he wanted to touch this scene, to be part of it. But then the habit of distance reasserted itself, and he stepped back, turned, and retreated without a word, leaving Evelyn staring after him with her heart aching for the man who would not let himself come in from the cold. The change began so subtly that Evelyn might have dismissed it as imagination had she not been so attuned to the rhythms of the household, to the particular quality of silence that preceded the Duke's approach. But in the days following that storm-torn morning when he had found her holding Caroline in the library, Sebastian began to appear more frequently in the spaces they occupied, no longer merely a shadow in the corridor but an actual presence in doorways, in the hall outside the schoolroom, and eventually, haltingly, just inside the threshold itself. His questions, when they came, were brief at first, delivered in that same formal tone she had come to recognize as his armor against feeling, "How does Lady Caroline progress with her Latin?" or "Has she shown improvement in her mathematics?" But gradually, imperceptibly, the questions shifted, became less about scholarly achievement and more about the child herself. Does she sleep well now? And have the storms troubled her again? And finally, said so quietly Evelyn almost missed it, does she ever speak of her parents? His presence, too, became less forbidding, though Evelyn could not have articulated precisely how this transformation manifested. Perhaps it was the way he no longer held himself quite so rigidly, or the manner in which his grey eyes had begun to warm slightly when they rested on Caroline, watching his niece with such barely concealed longing and pain that Evelyn had to look away from the naked vulnerability of it, understanding that she was witnessing something intensely private, a man trying to cross that river she had imagined, taking trembling steps toward a shore he had convinced himself was forever out of reach. Then came the afternoon, when he appeared in the schoolroom carrying 3 leather-bound volumes from what Evelyn had learned was his private collection, books he allowed no one to touch, and he set them on the desk with careful reverence and said, "These were favourites of mine as a boy. I thought perhaps Lady Caroline might benefit from them." And when Caroline opened the first and discovered illustrations of fantastic creatures and far-off lands, her face lit with the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen, and the Duke stood watching that smile as though it were the sun rising after an endless winter night. His hand pressed briefly to his chest as if his heart pained him. The evening he asked Evelyn to dine with him, she had expected another formal discussion of curriculum and conduct, but instead found herself seated across from him in the small dining room rather than the cavernous formal hall, and he spoke haltingly at first about Caroline's progress. Yes, but then somehow they were discussing Wordsworth and Byron, debating the merits of different translations of Homer, and he quoted Keats with surprising passion. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," and she responded with the next line, and something shifted in his expression, a softening she had not thought possible, and he said, very quietly, "I had forgotten that such conversations were possible, Miss Hartley, and I find I am grateful to remember." And Evelyn's heart, that treacherous organ, quickened its rhythm in a way that warned her she was in danger of feeling far more than was wise or appropriate for a governess in a duke's household, but she could not seem to stop the tide of warmth that flooded through her when he looked at her thus, with something in his eyes that might have been hope struggling to be born. The truth came to Evelyn in fragments, pieced together from whispered conversations half heard in corridors, from the housekeeper Mrs. Daventry's carefully measured words when Evelyn asked gentle questions about the family's history, from the way the maids averted their eyes when passing the portrait that remained turned toward the wall in the Duke's study, and most tellingly, from the Duke himself, in unguarded moments when grief flickered across his face like lightning illuminating a landscape of devastation. And what emerged from these fragments was a tragedy of such profound sorrow that Evelyn found her own, heart aching with an understanding that felt almost unbearable in its clarity. The woman in the portrait was Lady Isabella, Sebastian's younger sister by 3 years, beloved and spirited where he had been serious and duty-bound, and she had fallen desperately in love with a gentleman of good family but modest fortune, a Mr. Thomas Hartwell, whose warmth and kindness had won her heart completely. But Sebastian, then newly come into his title and rigid with the weight of responsibility and family pride, had disapproved of the match, had spoken harsh words about fortune hunters and unsuitable connections, had refused to attend the wedding, and though Isabella had married her beloved anyway, the rift between brother and sister had remained unhealed, a wound that festered through 2 years of silence broken only by formal notes on holidays, and then had come that terrible night 6 months past, when the storm raged and the carriage overturned, and both Isabella and Thomas were killed instantly, and Sebastian had received the news knowing that his sister had died, believing he cared more for status than for her happiness, that his last words to her had been cold and condemning, that he had wasted 2 years of pride when he might have known his niece, might have reconciled, might have told Isabella he loved her despite his disapproval, and this knowledge, this guilt, had frozen him solid, had convinced him that his coldness had as surely killed his sister as the storm itself, that he was unworthy of connection or love, that the only honorable path was isolation and penance, and that any warmth he might feel toward Caroline was a betrayal of the child's mother, any happiness he might experience an insult to Isabella's memory. Mrs. Daventry confided that the Duke had not smiled since the funeral, had turned his sister's portrait to the wall because he could not bear to see her face and know she had died unforgiven, and Evelyn understood then with piercing clarity that Sebastian's coldness was not cruelty but punishment, that he was both judge and condemned, that he had built Ashworth Manor into a prison and himself into its sole inmate, and that his distance from Caroline was not indifference but terrible fear that he would fail her as he had failed her mother, that his love would somehow curse rather than bless. This understanding shifted something fundamental in Evelyn's perception, transformed him from ice to wounded flesh, and she found herself lying awake at night thinking of him alone in his chambers wrestling with ghosts, found her heart contracting with compassion that felt dangerously close to something deeper and more consuming, found herself wanting not merely to help Caroline heal, but to reach across that chasm of guilt and pull Sebastian back from the edge of the abyss he had constructed for himself, and she recognized with both wonder and alarm that what she felt was no longer simply empathy, but the first trembling notes of love, unwelcome and undeniable, blooming like winter roses in the frozen garden of her carefully guarded heart. Winter deepened its hold on Ashworth Manor, transforming the grounds into a crystalline world of frost-laden branches and snow-dusted stone. And with the changing season came a shift in the household's rhythms that would have seemed impossible mere weeks before Sebastian began joining their lessons. Not every day, but often enough that Caroline would look toward the door with anticipation, and when he appeared she would smile with such unguarded joy that Evelyn's heart contracted to witness it, and he would read aloud from the books he had loved as a boy, his deep voice surprisingly gentle as he brought to life tales of knights and quests and honor. And Evelyn noticed how Caroline had begun to lean toward him, unconsciously, drawn like a flower toward sunlight, and how Sebastian's rigid posture would soften incrementally in the child's presence, his hands no longer clenched but resting open on his knees, as if learning slowly to receive rather than push away. Caroline laughed one afternoon at something Sebastian said, a dry observation about a particularly foolish character in their story, and the sound was so unexpected, so pure, that both adults froze, and Evelyn watched Sebastian's face transform with wonder and pain, and something approaching joy, watched him blink rapidly as if fighting tears, and when his eyes met hers across Caroline's bright head, the expression she found there was so raw, so vulnerable, that she had to look away from the intensity of it, her own heart hammering with recognition of something unspoken but undeniable building between them, like pressure before a storm. They began walking together in the afternoons while Caroline played in the snow under the watchful eye of a maid, and these walks became a ritual Evelyn found herself anticipating with an eagerness that bordered on impropriety. They would traverse the frost-covered gardens, discussing literature and philosophy and the nature of grief, and Sebastian spoke more freely during these walks than he ever did indoors, as if the open air loosened something in him, and he told her about Isabella in fragments, memories offered like precious broken things, how she had loved winter best of all seasons, how she had insisted on building snow fortresses every year, how her laughter had filled these very paths. And Evelyn listened and offered her own stories in return, tales of her childhood before loss had claimed it, and she felt they were trading pieces of themselves, building something fragile and profound from shared confession. One afternoon, as they stood in the library selecting volumes for Caroline's next lesson, they both reached for the same book, a collection of fairy tales with gilt-edged pages, and their hands collided, and Evelyn felt the contact like lightning through her entire body, a shock of awareness so powerful she gasped, and Sebastian's fingers closed briefly over hers, just for a moment, and when she found the courage to look up, his grey eyes were dark and intense, and fixed on her face with an expression she dare not interpret, though her body understood perfectly well what it meant, what that heated gaze implied, and neither of them moved, suspended in that charged moment, while winter light slanted through the windows and dust motes danced in the air between them, and then Sebastian withdrew his hand slowly, deliberately, and cleared his throat, and said something mundane about the book's binding, but his voice was rough, and his hand trembled slightly as he shelved the volume, and Evelyn stood there with her heart racing and her palm burning where his skin had touched hers, understanding with absolute certainty that something had shifted irrevocably between them, that the air itself had grown thick with unspoken feeling, with want and longing, and all the dangerous tender emotions she had promised herself she would not allow. But it was too late now, far, far too late, for her heart had already made its choice, whether her mind consented or not. The suggestion came hesitantly one morning as Caroline pressed her face to the frosted window and asked in her small, newly confident voice whether they might have a Christmas tree like she remembered from before, and Evelyn saw Sebastian stiffen at the question, saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow distant with memory, and she understood immediately that there had been no celebration since Isabella's death, that the house had remained locked in perpetual mourning. But when she glanced at Caroline's hopeful face, so much more alive now than the ghost child who had arrived months ago, she found herself speaking gently to Sebastian, suggesting that perhaps this year might be different, that Caroline had endured so much darkness and deserved some light, and she watched him struggle visibly with the request, watched guilt and longing war across his features, until finally his eyes settled on his niece, and something in him surrendered, and he nodded once, tersely, and Caroline's delighted squeal of joy seemed to crack something open in the frozen manor itself. The transformation began immediately, with Sebastian ordering evergreen boughs brought from the estate woods, and Caroline bouncing with excitement, as servants who had grown accustomed to gloom began stringing garlands along the grand staircase, and Evelyn found herself working alongside Sebastian in a partnership that felt startlingly natural and right. He would hold the ladder steady while she wove ribbons through pine branches, their fingers brushing as he handed up decorations, and she caught him watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that her breath would catch in her throat, and once when she nearly lost her balance, he caught her waist with both hands and steadied her, and for a moment they stood frozen, with his hands warm against her sides and their faces inches apart, and she saw his gaze drop to her lips before he released her quickly and turned away, but not before she glimpsed the heat in his eyes, the want he could not entirely conceal. They laughed together for the first time while attempting to string popcorn for the tree Caroline ate more than she threaded, and Sebastian made a dry observation about the economics of decoration versus consumption that struck Evelyn as so unexpectedly witty. She burst into genuine laughter, and the sound made Sebastian smile, actually smile, and the expression transformed his entire face from winter severity to something warm and almost boyish. And Evelyn felt her heart turn over completely in her chest, felt herself falling past the point of return into love that was no longer unwelcome, but embraced, despite its impossibility, despite the vast gulf of station and circumstance that separated a governess from a duke. Christmas Eve arrived soft with snow, and the manor glowed with candlelight and greenery, and after a simple but joyful dinner, Caroline asked Sebastian, not the Duke, not your Grace, but Uncle Sebastian, the words slipping out naturally as breath to read her bedtime story, and Evelyn watched Sebastian's face crack with emotion, watched him blink rapidly against tears as he nodded and took Caroline's small hand in his larger one, and later, when Evelyn passed Caroline's chamber, she heard his deep voice reading about Christmas magic and family, heard it break and roughen with feeling. And she stood in the corridor with her own tears falling because she understood she was witnessing a man learning to forgive himself, learning to accept love he believed he did not deserve, and she knew with bittersweet clarity that she loved him, loved them both, and that this makeshift family had become the home she had never dared hope to find, even as she understood that women in her position could not expect such happiness to last, that the magic of this Christmas might be all she would ever be permitted to hold. January arrived with bitter cold that matched the chill settling into Evelyn's bones, for something had shifted in Sebastian after the warmth of Christmas. He had withdrawn again, not completely but enough that she felt the distance like a physical ache, saw him watching her with an expression of such tortured longing and self-recrimination that her heart clenched with foreboding, and when he summoned her to his study one evening after Caroline had been put to bed, she went with trepidation coiling in her stomach, sensing that whatever waited behind his closed door would alter everything irrevocably. He stood by the window with his back to her when she entered, his shoulders rigid with tension, and for a long moment he said nothing, while she waited, with her pulse hammering in her throat, and when he finally turned, his face was haggard, aged by some internal struggle, his grey eyes dark with barely suppressed emotion, and he began speaking in a low, halting voice, so unlike his usual controlled tones that she knew immediately he was offering her something precious and terrible, his truth laid bare. He told her that she had brought light to his darkness in ways he had not believed possible, that watching her patience with Caroline had taught him that hope was not merely a word, but a practice, a daily choice to believe in redemption, and he confessed that somewhere between her arrival and this frozen January evening he had fallen utterly and completely in love with her, that she had become as necessary to him as breath, that the mere sight of her filled him with a longing so profound it unmade him, and Evelyn's heart soared with such fierce joy she thought she might shatter from it, thought she might weep or laugh or throw herself into his arms. But before she could speak, before she could give voice to the answering love that burned in her own chest, his expression closed like a door slamming shut, and he continued, speaking in a tone of terrible finality. He declared himself unworthy of any happiness, said his hands were still stained with Isabella's blood, through his negligence and coldness and stubborn pride, that he had pushed away his sister when she needed him most, and she had died believing him, disapproving and unloving, that he had failed in the most fundamental duty one, human, owed another, and such sins could not be washed away by a few months of playing at reformation, and Evelyn watched with dawning horror as he talked himself back into his prison of guilt, watched him choose familiar suffering over the terrifying vulnerability of acceptance, and she wanted to scream at him that he was wrong, that Isabella would not have wanted this self-flagellation, that love was not a reward one earned through sufficient penance, but a grace one chose to receive. But his face had become a mask of aristocratic control, every line of his body radiating rejection of the very happiness he had just confessed to wanting. And Evelyn understood with sickening certainty that he was preparing to push her away, that he had confessed his love only as prelude to denial, had opened his heart only to demonstrate why it must remain closed, and she stood frozen in his study while the fire crackled and the winter wind howled outside, and Sebastian looked at her with such anguish and such immovable determination that she knew, with the awful clarity of the inevitable, that he was about to break both their hearts in the name of honor, about to choose his guilt over her love, about to send her away because he believed suffering was what he deserved and joy was a betrayal of the sister he had failed. The words burst from Evelyn with quiet passion that belied the trembling in her hands, for she would not allow him to retreat into his fortress of guilt without speaking truths he needed to hear, and she told him that she saw his worth even if he could not, that she recognized in him a capacity for love so profound it terrified him into denial, and she spoke of how she had watched him transform over these months, from winter incarnate into something warmer and more human, watched him struggle daily against his own fear of failing those he cared for, and surely such struggle was evidence not of unworthiness, but of a heart that felt too much rather than too little. Her voice grew stronger as she stepped closer to him, watching his jaw tighten and his eyes fill with anguish, and she found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud, how her own parents had died of fever when she was Caroline's age, how her siblings had been scattered to different relatives who could not afford to keep them all together, how she had spent years in positions where she was valued for service but never for herself, years of loneliness that had taught her to recognize pain in others because she knew its contours intimately in her own soul. And she told him that this recognition was not pity but understanding, that she did not offer him love from naivety, but from hard-won knowledge of what it meant to carry grief and guilt as constant companions. She spoke of Caroline, how the child needed not a perfect guardian but a present one, how his niece had bloomed, not because he had executed flawless duty, but because he had shown up imperfectly, had tried despite his fear, had let himself be vulnerable enough to read a bedtime story with a breaking voice, and surely he could see that love was not betrayal of Isabella's memory, but the highest honor he could pay to his sister. For what would Isabella want if not for her daughter to be raised by someone capable of love, rather than trapped with someone performing perpetual penance? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she told him that the dead did not require our suffering as tribute, that true honor lay in embracing the life they would have wished for us, in allowing their loss to make us more tender rather than more stone, and she dared to reach for his hand, felt him flinch but not withdraw, and she said with all the conviction in her heart that she loved him, not despite his guilt and grief but with full awareness of them, that she was not some innocent fool stumbling into darkness, but a woman who had walked through her own shadows and emerged capable of standing beside him in his. But even as she spoke, she watched his face remain closed, watched him listen with anguished eyes that held both longing and implacable determination, and when she finally fell silent with her hand still holding his and her heart laid bare before him, he shook his head slowly and spoke in a voice of terrible quiet. Some sins were unforgivable, some stains could not be washed clean, and he would not compound his failures by allowing her to waste her precious light on a man who had proven himself incapable of protecting those he loved, would not risk failing her as he had failed Isabella, could not choose hope over the guilt that was all he deserved. And Evelyn felt something break inside her chest as she realized that no words of hers could breach the walls he had built, that he had already decided to send her away, that love alone was not enough to save someone who believed themselves beyond salvation. Evelyn did not sleep that night but sat in her small chamber, with her heart a leaden weight in her chest, replaying every word of their conversation and wondering if there was something more she might have said, some argument she had failed to make that would have breached the walls of his guilt. But she knew even as these thoughts circled uselessly that Sebastian had already made his decision before he had summoned her to his study, that his confession had been a kind of penance rather than an invitation, and when the clock in the hall struck midnight, its deep notes seemed to toll the end of something precious before it had truly begun, and she startled when a sharp knock came at her door, followed immediately by Mrs. Hallowell's stern voice informing her that the Duke required her presence in his study immediately, and Evelyn's heart lurched with a wild, desperate hope that perhaps he had reconsidered, that perhaps the hours since their conversation had brought him clarity rather than further entrenchment in his suffering. But when she entered his study, Sebastian stood behind his desk with terrible formality in every line of his body, and she knew before he spoke that hope had been a foolish thing to harbor. He did not meet her eyes as he informed her in a voice devoid of all warmth that her services as governess were no longer required, that he was releasing her from her position, effective immediately, and when she opened her mouth to protest, he continued speaking with relentless precision, telling her that a carriage was waiting to convey her to London, where he had arranged an excellent position with a respectable family, that his solicitor had prepared generous references and a sum sufficient to settle her comfortably until she took up her new post, and the very thoroughness of these arrangements told Evelyn he had been planning this dismissal even as he had confessed his love, that perhaps the confession itself had been his way of explaining why he must send her away, and she found her voice finally to ask, what of Caroline? What would happen to the child who had only just begun to emerge from her shell of grief? And Sebastian's jaw tightened as he cut her off with words sharp as blades, informing her that another governess had already been secured, a Mrs. Pemberton of unimpeachable credentials who would arrive within the week, and Caroline would adjust as children do because children were resilient, and it was better for his niece to learn early that attachments were temporary and people left, and one must not depend too heavily on anyone's continued presence. Evelyn stared at him in horrified disbelief as he spoke these terrible lies, watched him retreat into the very coldness he had been slowly thawing from, and she said, his name, just his name, Sebastian, soft and broken, but he flinched as though she had struck him, and told her the carriage was waiting, and she must go now. Immediately, there was nothing more to discuss, and when she tried once more to speak, he finally met her eyes, and what she saw there stopped her words in her throat, for his grey eyes held such anguish and such immovable determination that she understood he would not relent, that he had chosen his suffering over her love and would pursue that choice to its bitter conclusion. His voice, when he spoke again, was iron, though his hands trembled where they gripped the desk, and he said he could not, would not allow her to waste her light on his darkness, that she deserved happiness he was incapable of providing, that her continued presence would only bring pain to them both, and this was his final word on the matter, and Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face as she recognized defeat, as she understood that sometimes love was not enough to save someone who believed themselves beyond salvation, and she turned without another word, because there were no words left that would change his mind. And as she reached the door, she heard him speak once more, in a voice so low she almost missed it, 3 words that sounded like they were torn from somewhere deep and bleeding. "Forgive me, Evelyn," and she fled, before he could see her completely break apart. Evelyn's hands trembled as she threw her meagre belongings into the worn travelling case that had accompanied her to Ashworth Manor mere months ago, though it felt like a lifetime, and tears blurred her vision as she folded the simple dresses and wrapped the few books she owned, each movement mechanical, because if she allowed herself to think, truly think about what was happening, she would collapse entirely and never find the strength to leave this room. And some part of her kept expecting a knock at the door, kept hoping, despite everything, that Sebastian would come to tell her he had changed his mind, that love was stronger than his guilt, but the only sound was the clock's relentless ticking, counting down the minutes until the carriage would carry her away from the man she loved and the child who had become like a daughter to her heart. She could not leave without saying something, could not let him persist in his terrible conviction that suffering was all he deserved, and so she pulled out her writing paper with shaking hands and began to write, and once she started, the words poured from her like water from a broken dam, everything she had not been able to make him hear when they stood face to face in his study, and she wrote of her love for him, not the timid admiration of a governess for her employer, but the deep abiding love of a woman who saw a man's soul entire and chose it despite and because of all its scars and shadows, and she wrote of Caroline, and how the child needed not a perfect guardian sculpted from duty, but a flawed human uncle who showed up imperfectly and tried and loved her despite his fear of failing, and she wrote of Isabella, and how she was certain, absolutely certain, that his sister would not want him to spend his life in penance, but would want him to live and love and find joy, because that was what people who loved us truly wanted, not our suffering as eternal tribute, but our healing and our happiness. The letter grew longer as Evelyn's tears fell onto the paper, smearing some words, but she did not care, because she needed him to understand that redemption was not something earned through enough suffering, but something chosen daily through small acts of courage, through the decision to remain present rather than retreat, through the willingness to love despite the ever-present possibility of loss. And she told him she believed in him, even if he could not believe in himself, that she had watched him transform from winter into something warmer over their months together. And she begged him to choose life over guilt, hope over fear, love over the cold comfort of isolation, and finally, she wrote her address, the widow Morrison's boarding house in Chelsea, because even knowing he would not come, even understanding he had chosen his suffering over her love, she could not help but leave him a thread to follow if he ever found the courage to reach for it. She sealed the letter with wax from the candle by her bedside and held it against her heart for one long moment, and then she understood she could not give it to him directly because he would refuse it or destroy it unread, could not leave it in her room where a servant might find it and return it to her. And suddenly she remembered a conversation weeks ago when they had walked through the library and Sebastian had pointed to a shelf of poetry volumes and mentioned in a voice tight with old pain that those had been Isabella's favorites, that he had not been able to open them since her death because her handwriting filled the margins with notes and observations. And Evelyn knew with sudden certainty where the letter needed to go. She crept through the silent manor with her heart pounding, grateful that the household slept and no one witnessed her, moving through corridors she would never walk again. And in the library, she found the poetry shelf easily and ran her fingers along the spines until she found the volume Sebastian had lingered over. Longest Wordsworth, Isabella's favorite, he had said, and she slipped her letter between its pages near the middle, where he would find it if he ever found the courage to open the book that held his sister's voice, and she pressed her hand against the leather binding as if she could pour all her love and hope into it through touch alone. The carriage waited in the drive with its lamps burning against the pre-dawn darkness, and Mrs. Hallowell stood beside it with disapproval written in every line of her face, though Evelyn thought she caught something almost like sympathy in the housekeeper's eyes when she handed Evelyn an envelope, thick with the references and money Sebastian had arranged, and Evelyn climbed into the carriage without looking back at the manor, because if she looked, she would see Caroline's window and she would break entirely. And as the horses began to move and the wheels crunched on gravel, she finally allowed herself to weep in great tearing sobs that shook her whole body, and through the window she watched Ashworth Manor disappear into the darkness behind her, like a dream dissolving upon waking, taking with it everything she had not known she wanted until she had found and lost it in the space of a few precious months. Sebastian sat alone in his study as the first grey light of dawn crept through the windows, the silence so absolute it seemed to have physical weight pressing against his chest until he could scarcely breathe, and he told himself with grim determination that he had done the right thing, the only thing, because Evelyn deserved happiness and light and a future unburdened by his darkness, and she would forget him in time and find some worthy man in London who could offer her everything Sebastian's broken soul could not provide. But even as he formed these thoughts, they rang hollow as a cracked bell, and he reached for the brandy decanter with shaking hands, only to find it empty, because he had consumed its contents during the terrible hours after sending her away. The manor felt different already, as though Evelyn's absence had leached something vital from the very stones, and Sebastian recognized this feeling with bitter familiarity because it was the same desolation that had consumed him after Isabella's death, the same crushing certainty that he had destroyed something precious through his own actions, and he pressed his palms against his eyes until colors burst behind his lids because he would not weep. He had made his choice and must live with its consequences, as he had lived with all his other failures. A sound from the corridor made him lift his head, small footsteps approaching, hesitant and uneven, and his heart clenched because he knew those footsteps as well as his own. And then Caroline stood in his doorway, in her white nightgown, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and tears streaming down her face, and she looked at him with such betrayal in her eyes that Sebastian felt something crack inside his chest. "Why did you send her away?" Caroline's voice was small and broken, stripped of the confidence and joy that Evelyn had so patiently cultivated over months of gentle care, and Sebastian opened his mouth to offer the careful explanations he had prepared about Miss Hartley's better opportunities and the new governess, who would arrive soon. But Caroline continued speaking before he could form words, her child's voice trembling with an anguish that mirrored his own. "She was the only person who made me feel safe," Caroline said, and each word was a dagger finding its mark in Sebastian's heart. "She was the only one who stayed with me during the storms, who sang to me, who made me remember that Mama and Papa would want me to be happy again. And you sent her away just like you sent everyone away. And I know you sent Mama away too before she died, because I heard the servants talking about how you fought, and she left crying. And now everyone I love disappears, and I will always be alone, because you cannot bear for anyone to stay." The child's words tumbled out in a torrent of grief and accusation, and Sebastian felt the careful edifice of his justifications crumble to dust, because Caroline had spoken the truth he had not allowed himself to see, that in sending Evelyn away, he had not protected her, but had instead repeated his greatest taste, sin, the pattern that had defined and destroyed his life, pushing away love from misguided self-righteousness and choosing isolation over the terrifying vulnerability of connection. He had told himself he was being noble, self-sacrificing, that Evelyn deserved better than what he could offer, but Caroline's tear-stained face showed him the bitter truth that his nobility was nothing more than cowardice dressed in pretty words, that he had chosen the cold comfort of familiar guilt over the frightening possibility of redemption because suffering was easier than hope, because remaining in his self-imposed prison meant he never had to risk failing someone he loved again. "I thought I was protecting you both," Sebastian heard himself say, his voice hoarse and broken, but Caroline shook her head with a vehemence that reminded him painfully of Isabella at that age. "You were protecting yourself," the child said with devastating clarity, and then she turned and fled back to her chambers, leaving Sebastian alone with the wreckage of his choices and the horrible understanding that he had become the very thing he most despised, a man who sacrificed others' happiness on the altar of his own fear, who called his cowardice wisdom and his isolation nobility, and in that moment of shattering recognition, Sebastian knew he could not let this stand, could not allow another person he loved to believe she had been abandoned because of some failing in herself rather than his own weakness. Dawn crept through the windows of Sebastian's study like an unwelcome witness to his desperation as he tore through drawers and papers with hands that shook so violently he could barely grasp the documents he scattered across the portion floor, searching for anything Evelyn might have left behind, an address, a note, some thread, however thin, that he might follow to find her in the vast, indifferent sprawl of London. But there was nothing. Only his own correspondence and ledgers, and the careful weekly reports she had written about Caroline's progress in her neat, precise hand that now seemed to mock him with their professional distance. He summoned Mrs. Hallowell with a violence that brought the housekeeper running, her face creased with alarm at his wild appearance, and he demanded to know where Miss Hartley had gone, what direction the carriage had taken, whether she had left any word of her destination. But Mrs. Hallowell shook her head with something like pity in her severe features, and said only that Miss Hartley had instructed the driver to take her to London, no specific address given, and that she had wept the entire way down the drive until she disappeared from view. London, a city of millions, a labyrinth of streets and boarding houses and places a woman alone might disappear into as though she had never existed, and Sebastian felt panic rise in his throat like bile because he had sent her away with money and references, but had been so consumed with his own twisted nobility that he had not thought to ask where she would go, had not wanted to know because knowing would have made it harder to maintain the fiction that he was acting in her best interest rather than his own cowardice. He took the stairs to her former chambers 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs with desperate hope that she might have left something behind in her haste, some clue he could follow, but when he threw open the door he found the room stripped bare, the bed neatly made, the wardrobe empty, the small desk where she had prepared her lessons cleared of every paper and pen, and the emptiness was more devastating than any accusation because it showed how completely she had been erased from his household, as though the months of her presence had been nothing more than a dream. Caroline stood in the doorway behind him, her small face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow with the same grief that had consumed her after her parents' death, and Sebastian saw with terrible clarity that he had broken this child again, had taught her that love was something temporary and conditional, that people left without warning and did not return, and the knowledge was a knife twisting in his chest because he had promised himself he would protect Caroline, and instead he had visited upon her the same abandonment that had shattered him when Isabella died. He returned to his study with Caroline trailing behind him like a ghost, and something in him snapped as he looked at the orderly shelves and carefully arranged furniture, at the portrait of Isabella still turned toward the wall, at all the careful structures he had built to contain his grief and guilt, and suddenly he was pulling books from their places and hurling them across the room, overturning the desk that had belonged to his father and grandfather, tearing at the curtains as though he could physically destroy the prison he had made of his life. And Caroline watched from the doorway without speaking, without crying, simply bearing witness to her uncle's dissolution with eyes that had seen too much loss for one so young. Papers flew like snow, leather bindings cracked against walls, and Sebastian's breath came in ragged gasps as he destroyed everything within reach, consumed by a desperation that had no outlet and no solution because Evelyn was gone, and he had no way to find her, no way to tell her that Caroline had shown him the truth of his cruelty, no way to beg for the chance he had thrown away when he sent her into the night, and the impossibility of it drove him to further destruction, pulling down shelves and scattering their contents across the floor in a wild animal grief that cared nothing for dignity or restraint. The candle toppled as Sebastian swept his arm across the mantelpiece in his fury, the brass holder clattering to the floor where the flame caught the edge of a discarded curtain he had torn from its fixtures moments before, and for several heartbeats he did not notice as he continued his destruction, pulling down more books and scattering papers, until Mrs. Hallowell's scream pierced through his madness, and he turned to see orange flames crawling up the heavy velvet with hungry speed, already spreading to the wooden paneling and the papers that littered the floor like kindling waiting for purpose. Servants rushed in with buckets and water, their faces pale with terror, and Sebastian stumbled backward as smoke began to fill the study. Acrid and thick, but even as the household mobilized to fight the fire, he felt something crystallize in his mind, with the perfect clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis. Evelyn would not have left without some word, some message, because that was not her nature, patient and persistent and believing always in second chances, even for those who had forfeited the right to them, and if she had left a message it would be hidden somewhere he would eventually find it, somewhere that meant something, somewhere that connected to all the careful healing she had done in this house. The library, the thought struck him like lightning as flames spread from his study into the corridor, servants shouting now and forming chains to pass buckets, and Sebastian pushed through them with sudden desperate purpose because the library adjoined his study and the fire was spreading fast, smoke already seeping under the connecting door, and Mrs. Hallowell grabbed his arm, crying that he must evacuate, that the east wing would be consumed within minutes. But he shook her off with strength born of certainty and threw open the library door to find the room already hazed with smoke, the shelves of books that had been his solace and his prison now threatened by the flames that licked at the doorframe behind him. He could barely breathe, his eyes streaming, but he stumbled toward the poetry section where Isabella's books stood in their place of honor, the volumes he had not touched since her death because they carried too much memory and too much pain, and his hands found the familiar spine of Wordsworth, the green leather binding Isabella had loved, the book she had read aloud to him when they were children in the gardens that were now overgrown with his neglect, and he pulled it from the shelf as a beam cracked somewhere above, and burning ash rained down on his shoulders. The servants hauled him bodily from the library as the ceiling began to collapse, dragging him through the smoke-filled corridor and out onto the frost-covered lawn, where he fell to his knees coughing and retching, while the east wing of Ashworth Manor burned behind him with a roar like judgment, and his hands were blistered where he had touched burning wood, but he barely felt the pain because he was opening the book with trembling fingers, and there between the pages of Tintern Abbey, the poem about returning to a place of memory and finding it transformed, a folded letter fell into his lap, his name written on it in Evelyn's careful hand. Sebastian opened the letter, as around him servants ran and shouted, and Caroline stood wrapped in Mrs. Hallowell's arms watching her home burn, and he read by the light of the fire that consumed his past, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face as Evelyn's words reached across the miles between them and offered him the absolution he had never believed possible, and in his burned hands He held not just a letter but a map, leading out of the darkness he had inhabited for so long, a thread to follow back toward light and life and the terrifying possibility of love. Sebastian's hands shook so violently that the pages of the letter trembled in his grip as he read Evelyn's words by the lurid orange light of his burning home, and the first line struck him with such force that he had to pause to draw breath through lungs already raw with smoke. Your Grace, though I find I can no longer think of you by that title, for in my heart you have become simply Sebastian, the man who learned to read bedtime stories with a gentleness that belied every cold word you spoke in self-protection. She had seen through him from the beginning, he realized, had understood the armor he wore, even as he convinced himself it was impenetrable, and she continued, I write this knowing you may never find it, knowing you have sent me away, believing it an act of noble sacrifice, but I cannot leave without speaking truths you need to hear, even if you refuse to believe them. You are not the villain of your sister's story. Sebastian, you are merely a man who loved imperfectly and has punished himself far more cruelly than she would ever have wished. His vision blurred with tears that had nothing to do with the smoke, as Evelyn's words dismantled every besetted fortress he had built around his guilt. Isabella spoke of you, often in the months before her marriage. Did you know? Mrs. Hallowell told me of the letters your sister wrote to you, letters you returned unopened because you could not bear what you perceived as her betrayal in choosing love over duty. But Sebastian, she did not see it as betrayal. She saw it as becoming herself, and she grieved, not your disapproval but your absence from her joy. She wanted you at her wedding not to gain your blessing but to share her happiness with the brother she adored. Your silence hurt her, yes, but she understood it as the action of a man terrified of loss, not one incapable of love. The words continued in Evelyn's careful script, now blurred where his tears fell upon the ink. I have come to love you, Sebastian, not despite your guilt, but because of how deeply you feel, how thoroughly you believe yourself unworthy of grace. It is the mark of a man who cares too much, not too little, and I would spend my life showing you that you deserve the love you deny yourself if you would only let me. Caroline needs you not as a perfect guardian, untouched by grief, but as a man who understands loss and chooses daily to love her anyway, who shows her that sorrow does not preclude joy, that we honor the dead not by entombing ourselves with them, but by living the lives they wished for us. Evelyn wrote of her own losses, parents taken by fever, siblings scattered to distant relatives, years of loneliness in houses where she was needed but not cherished, and how Caroline's silent grief had called to something in her own battered heart, how Sebastian's carefully hidden tenderness had shown her that the most damaged souls often hold the greatest capacity for love because they know its value, its rarity, its terrible price. Your sister would not want you to stop living, Sebastian, Evelyn wrote near the letter's end. She would want you to raise her daughter with laughter, to find love again, to forgive yourself, the way she already has forgiven you, from whatever place the dead watch over those they loved. True honor to Isabella lies not in perpetual penance, but in becoming the man she always believed you could be present, vulnerable, willing to risk pain for the possibility of connection. I am staying at the Widow Morrison's boarding house in Chelsea, but I do not write this address as demand or expectation. I write it as hope, as an open door you may walk through if you can find the courage to believe you deserve happiness. I will wait, Sebastian, but I pray you do not wait too long to choose life over mere existence, love over fear, grace over guilt. Yours, if you will have me, Evelyn. Sebastian thrust the letter into his coat and ran for the stables, while behind him the east wing of Ashworth Manor collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, the servants watching in stunned silence as their master, who had not ridden anywhere in months, saddled his black stallion with hands that barely functioned through bandages and burns, and Mrs. Hallowell called after him that he needed a physician, that he was in no condition to travel, but he was already mounted and wheeling the horse toward the drive with a desperation that bordered on madness, because every moment that passed was another moment. Evelyn believed herself unwanted. Another moment her heart broke a little more thoroughly, and he could not bear the thought of her pain when he had caused so much already through his cowardice, dressed as nobility. The ride to London took the entire night, Sebastian pushing his mount harder than wisdom allowed along roads still frosted with winter's grip, and he did not feel the cold that bit through his smoke-damaged clothes or the agony of his burned hands gripping the reins, because all his awareness had narrowed to a single desperate prayer repeated with each hoofbeat. Let me not be too late. Let her not have given up on me. Let there be one more chance to choose differently than I have chosen all my life. Dawn was breaking over London's rooftops when he finally found Chelsea, the city waking around him as vendors set up carts and early risers hurried toward their employment, and he knew he must look like a madman, clothes reeking of smoke and ash, face soot-stained, hands wrapped in hasty bandages that were stained through with blood and burns. But he cared nothing for appearances as he searched desperately for the widow Morrison's boarding house, finding it at last on a quiet street where bare winter trees stood like sentinels before a respectable but modest establishment that housed women of limited means and genteel backgrounds. The widow herself answered his frantic knocking, a stern-faced woman of middle years who took one look at his disheveled state and began to close the door until Sebastian managed to gasp out his name and title, and something in his raw desperation must have moved her because she paused and studied him with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every sign of his suffering before she said in a voice that carried warning, "Miss Hartley is in the garden, Your Grace, though I wonder if you deserve to see her given that she has done nothing but weep since she arrived 3 days ago." The words were knives in his heart, but he accepted them as deserved penance and followed the widow through the particular, narrow house and out into a small walled garden where winter roses still bloomed in defiant clusters against the cold. And there among the frost-touched flowers stood Evelyn in a simple grey dress, her back to him as she stared at nothing, and Sebastian's breath caught, because even from behind he could see the defeat in the curve of her shoulders, the weight of grief in her posture, and when she turned at the sound of the widow's voice and saw him standing there burned and desperate and barely able to stand from exhaustion and pain. Her expression transformed through shock to anguish to something that looked terrifyingly like fragile hope, and Sebastian found himself completely unmade by the sight of her tear-stained face, by the way she pressed one hand to her mouth as if to hold back a sob, by the question in her red-rimmed eyes that asked without words whether he had come to hurt her again or finally, to choose her. Sebastian fell to his knees in the frost-touched garden without thought for dignity or station, his burned hands reaching toward Evelyn in supplication as words poured from him in a torrent he could not control, everything he had spent a lifetime concealing now exposed in the morning light. I am terrified, Evelyn terrified, that I will fail you as I failed Isabella, that my coldness will poison whatever it touches, that everyone I allow myself to love will suffer for the sin of my caring, and his voice broke on the words, but he forced himself to continue because she deserved his truth, even if she rejected him for it. I convinced myself that sending you away was noble sacrifice, that denying my heart was protecting you from the corruption of my guilt, but Caroline looked at me with such betrayal when she discovered what I had done, and I saw myself, as I truly am not a man choosing honor but a coward, choosing the familiar pain of isolation over the terrifying vulnerability of love. Evelyn stood frozen before him, tears streaming down her face as he spoke, and Sebastian knew he must look utterly broken, kneeling there in clothes that reeked of smoke and failure, hands wrapped in blood-stained bandages, but he had nothing left to offer except his wounded truth. You wrote in your letter that I am not the villain of Isabella's story, but I have made myself the villain of my own, building prisons from guilt and calling them monuments to the dead, when truly they were only shields against the possibility of future pain. I have been so afraid of failing those I love that I chose not to love at all, but you, Evelyn, you showed me through your patience with Caroline that redemption is not some distant peak to be achieved through sufficient suffering, but a daily choice to show up despite fear, to love imperfectly but presently, to accept grace we believe ourselves unworthy to receive. His burned hands trembled as he held them out to her, palms up in surrender. I rode through fire to find your letter, burned my hands, pulling it from the flames, consuming my library, and even that pain was nothing compared to the agony of reading your words and knowing I had hurt you through my stubborn insistence on penance over healing. I do not come here begging forgiveness, Evelyn, for I have no right to ask it, but I am begging for the chance to try, to prove through action, rather than words, that I can learn to choose life over mere existence, hope over guilt, love over the cold comfort of familiar suffering. Evelyn moved then, crossing the small distance between them and sinking to her knees before him, so they knelt facing each other among the winter roses, and with infinite gentleness she took his bandaged hands in hers and spoke in a voice thick with tears, but steady with conviction. "Sebastian, you speak of being unworthy, as though worth must be earned through perfection. But you already are worthy, not because you have atoned sufficiently for imagined sins, but because you are a man capable of profound love, who has merely been too frightened to let himself feel it, and I would rather spend my life loving you through your fears and doubts than live without you in sterile safety." She raised his damaged hands to her lips and kissed them with such tenderness that Sebastian felt something fundamental shift within his chest, some frozen place he had not known existed, beginning finally to thaw. "You do not need to be perfect, my love. You only need to be present. Present for Caroline, who needs an uncle who understands grief. Present for me, who chooses you, not despite your wounds, but because I see in them evidence of how deeply you feel, how thoroughly you care. How much courage it takes for you to be here now, offering me your broken truth instead of polished lies." Sebastian pulled her into his arms with a sound that was half sob and half laugh, burying his face in her hair as years of carefully maintained control finally shattered completely, and Evelyn held him while he wept with the abandoned grief of a man who had finally given himself permission to feel everything he had spent so long denying. And the winter sun rose higher over the Chelsea garden, where two wounded souls knelt together and chose healing over hiding, love over fear, the terrifying beauty of hope over the cold certainty of despair. 3 years had passed since that frost-touched morning in the Chelsea garden, and Ashworth Manor stood rebuilt and transformed, where once darkened windows had stared like hollow eyes across neglected grounds. Now warm light spilled from every room onto gardens that bloomed with careful tending, and where silence had reigned like a suffocating blanket, now the bright cascade of piano music drifted through halls that had learned to welcome joy instead of merely housing grief. Lady Caroline Ashworth, now 10 years old and no longer a ghost child dressed in mourning grey but a vibrant girl in spring-green muslin, sat at the pianoforte in the drawing-room playing a Beethoven sonata with concentration and skill, and watching her with matching expressions of profound contentment were her uncle Sebastian and Aunt Evelyn, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, their chairs drawn close together in the easy intimacy of those who have learned that love is not the absence of wounds, but the daily choice to heal them together. On the wall behind them hung the restored portrait of Isabella, no longer turned away in shame, but displayed prominently where her gentle smile seemed to bless the life her brother had finally allowed himself to live, and Sebastian sometimes spoke to it in passing, telling his sister of Caroline's accomplishments and his own hard-won happiness. No longer seeking forgiveness, he had learned to grant himself, but simply sharing his life with the memory of one who had loved him. The east wing bore evidence of its rebuilding, new timbers blended with old, and Sebastian often said the manor was better for having burned that. Sometimes what appears as destruction is merely clearing ground for something stronger to grow in its place, and Evelyn would touch his scarred hands with infinite gentleness and remind him that the same was true of hearts. He still carried shadows. There were days when guilt whispered its familiar poison, and he withdrew into old patterns of isolation, but Evelyn had learned to recognize these moments and would simply sit beside him in patient silence until he remembered he no longer had to carry his burdens alone, and Caroline, intuitive child that she was, would climb into his lap and tell him stories until his arms tightened around her and the shadows receded once more. Because healing is not a destination reached, but a practice maintained through small daily acts of courage and connection. Dear listener, there are times when guilt feels safer than grace, when we convince ourselves that suffering honors those we have lost or harmed, when the familiar weight of shame seems preferable to the terrifying lightness of forgiveness. But the greatest tribute to those who loved us is not eternal penance, but the courage to accept love when it arrives, wearing unexpected faces, offering undeserved mercy. Sometimes, redemption wears the face of a patient woman who sees worth we have buried beneath years of self-condemnation. Sometimes healing requires we burn down the prisons we have built around our hearts and call monuments to the dead. And always, transformation happens, not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated small moments, when we choose vulnerability over safety, hope over despair, the messy beauty of imperfect love over the cold perfection of isolation. May you find the courage to open the locked doors within your own heart, to pull the portraits you have turned toward walls back into light, to accept that you are worthy not because you have suffered sufficiently, but simply because you exist and are capable of love. May you discover that forgiveness of yourself and others is not betrayal of those you have failed, but the truest form of honor, a way of saying that their love was not wasted on you, but planted seeds that bloom still in the garden of your transformed life. And may you rest tonight knowing that it is never too late to choose love over fear, hope over guilt, presence over perfection, life abundant over mere existence that even burned hands can learn to hold tenderly, even guilt-stricken hearts can learn to hope again. Even those who have sent love away at midnight can ride through fire to reclaim it in the morning. Peace be with you in your own journey from darkness into light, and may you find waiting there the grace you have convinced yourself you do not deserve, but which has been yours all along. Patient as winter roses, steady as the dawn,